The story of the Holocaust cannot be understood without looking back over many centuries to trace the deep historical roots of anti-Semitism in Europe. The Nazi genocide of the Jews between 1941 and 1945 was not born overnight. It was the culmination of social prejudices, religious intolerance, political manipulation, and pseudoscientific theories that had developed and mutated over time. These seeds of hatred were sown long before Adolf Hitler came to power, deeply embedding themselves in European societies. This chapter will explore the origins and evolution of anti-Semitism in Europe from the early medieval period through the Enlightenment into the 19th century and finally to the eve of the 20th century, showing how a combination of religious, economic, political, and racial ideas gradually created a climate in which genocide became possible. Early Christian hostility and the roots of religious anti-Semitism. In the first centuries of the Christian era, the relationship between Jews and Christians was shaped by the theological split that emerged from the rise of Christianity itself. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew, and his earliest followers were Jewish. But as Christianity evolved into a separate faith, tensions grew. Early Christian leaders such as St. John Chrysostom and later medieval theologians portrayed Jews as obstinate rejectors of the true faith. The crucifixion narrative, which placed partial blame on Jewish authorities for Jesus' death, became a central polemical tool, leading to the charge of deicide, the killing of God. This accusation became a cornerstone of religious anti-Semitism for centuries. While Roman authorities had executed Jesus, the popular Christian belief that the Jews bore collective, eternal guilt ensured that anti-Semitism became embedded in Christian culture. As Christianity spread across Europe and became the dominant religion, Jews often found themselves as religious outsiders in a Christian world. In the early Middle Ages, the church's councils and laws began restricting Jewish rights. They were barred from certain professions, forbidden to hold positions of authority over Christians, and required to live under separate regulations. The church's official stance did not always advocate outright violence, but it endorsed a worldview in which Jews were tolerated only as a marginalized, inferior community, a witness people whose continued existence was meant to prove Christian truth, medieval myths, violence, and the birth of stereotypes. By the High Middle Ages, 11th-13th centuries, anti-Semitism had evolved beyond theology into popular myths and conspiracies. Among the most dangerous was the blood libel, the false accusation that Jews kidnapped and murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, especially for Passover bread. This baseless myth first appeared in England in 1144 with the case of William of Norwich and spread rapidly across Europe, sparking riots and massacres. Another common myth was the host desecration charge, the claim that Jews stole and defiled the consecrated bread of the Christian Eucharist in an attempt to kill Christ again. These accusations often led to pogroms, organized massacres, and expulsions. Economic resentment also fueled hostility. Barred from owning land in most places, many Jews became involved in money lending, a profession stigmatized by Christian teachings against usury, while Jews often acted as intermediaries in medieval economies. Their visible role in finance made them convenient scapegoats during periods of economic hardship. Medieval Europe saw repeated episodes of violence against Jewish communities. During the Crusades, particularly the First Crusade in 1096, mobs of crusaders massacred thousands of Jews in the Rhineland cities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. Later, in the 14th century, Jews were falsely accused of causing the Black Death by poisoning wells, leading to mass burnings and expulsions. These acts were not random. They reflected an ingrained mindset that Jews were perpetual outsiders who could be blamed for society's ills, expulsions, and the ghetto system. By the late Middle Ages, many European kingdoms began expelling Jews altogether. England expelled its Jews in 1290. France followed in 1306 with repeated re-expulsions in later centuries. And Spain in 1492 under Ferdinand and Isabella's Catholic monarchy. The Spanish expulsion came after years of forced conversions, the rise of the Inquisition, and suspicions toward conversos converted Jews who were accused of secretly practicing Judaism. These expulsions pushed Jewish communities eastward into Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire, where relative tolerance allowed them to rebuild. In many places where Jews remained, they were forced into segregated districts known as ghettos, a system formalized in Venice in 1516. Ghettos were often locked at night, physically enclosing Jewish life within high walls and narrow streets. This enforced separation reinforced Christian perceptions of Jews as alien, while also fostering the internal cohesion of Jewish culture and religion. Anti-Semitism in the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries brought new intellectual currents to Europe, challenging traditional religious authority and promoting ideals of equality. Paradoxically, while some Enlightenment thinkers, such as Moses Mendelssohn, championed Jewish emancipation, others recast anti-Semitism in secular terms. Thinkers like Voltaire criticized Judaism not for theological reasons, but for what they saw as its tribalism or resistance to assimilation. This enlightened anti-Semitism stripped away medieval superstition, but retained the prejudice, now justified as cultural or philosophical critique. The French Revolution, 1789, briefly transformed Jewish life in Western Europe by granting full citizenship to Jews for the first time in modern history. Napoleon carried these reforms into territories he conquered, dismantling ghetto walls. However, emancipation provoked backlash. Conservatives feared that granting Jews equality would disrupt the Christian social order, while some liberals argued that Jews should first abandon their distinct cultural practices. This tension between assimilation and prejudice persisted throughout the 19th century. The rise of modern political and racial anti-Semitism. By the mid-19th century, anti-Semitism was increasingly shaped by nationalism and pseudo-scientific racism, the unification of Germany and Italy, and the growing sense of ethnic identity across Europe often excluded Jews from the national family. They were depicted as rootless cosmopolitans or as alien infiltrators. During economic depressions, especially in the 1870s, populist politicians exploited anti-Semitism to rally support, accusing Jews of controlling banks, the press, or governments. The new racial science of the late 19th century, inspired by misapplications of Darwinian theory, classified Jews as a distinct and inferior race. This scientific anti-Semitism went beyond religious conversion. In this worldview, even baptized Jews remained racially Jewish and thus unassimilable. Writers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain in Germany popularized the notion of an eternal racial struggle between Aryans and Jews, laying ideological groundwork for Nazi thought. Pogroms in Eastern Europe and the spread of conspiracy theories while Western Europe debated Jewish emancipation. Eastern Europe, particularly the Russian Empire, saw waves of violent pogroms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, triggered by political unrest, assassinations, or fabricated accusations. These pogroms devastated Jewish communities in Ukraine, Poland, and beyond. Russian authorities often tolerated or even encouraged the violence, using anti-Semitism as a tool to distract from social and economic grievances. One of the most insidious products of this period was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated document purporting to reveal a Jewish conspiracy to dominate the world. First published in Russia in 1903, the protocols were later circulated internationally, influencing anti-Semites from the United States to Germany, despite being debunked repeatedly. The text's themes fed into the Nazi narrative of a global Jewish plot, anti-Semitism on the eve of the 20th century. By the early 1900s, anti-Semitism had become a complex mixture of religious hostility, economic scapegoating, nationalist exclusion, and racial ideology. The Dreyfus Affair in France, 1894-1906, in which an army officer was falsely convicted of treason, demonstrated how deeply prejudice persisted even in supposedly liberal societies. In Central Europe, anti-Semitic political parties gained seats in parliaments, openly calling for restrictions on Jewish life. This climate meant that when the First World War erupted in 1914, Jews were already vulnerable to being portrayed as traitors or profiteers. The social upheavals and economic crises that followed the war, particularly in Germany, where defeat and the Treaty of Versailles created fertile ground for scapegoating, allowed anti-Semitic ideas to flourish with renewed intensity. Hitler and the Nazi Party would inherit and radicalize these centuries-old prejudices, transforming them into a program of systematic extermination. The year 1933 stands as one of the most decisive turning points in modern history. It marked the moment when the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, transformed itself from a radical political movement on the margins into the ruling force of Germany. This seizure of power was not a single, sudden event, but rather a process, part political maneuver, part mass mobilization, and part ruthless suppression of opponents, that unfolded over months and consolidated rapidly. By the end of that year, Germany had ceased to be a democratic republic and was instead well on its way toward becoming a totalitarian state. Understanding how this happened requires examining the political instability of the Weimar Republic, the economic despair of the Great Depression, the failures of democratic parties, and the Nazi Party's calculated exploitation of fear, nationalism, and prejudice. The crisis of the Weimar Republic. The Nazi rise to power cannot be separated from the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democratic experiment after World War I. Established in 1919, the Weimar Republic inherited a nation deeply embittered by military defeat, the punitive Treaty of Versailles, and the loss of national prestige. Political life in the 1920s was polarized between the far-left communists and the far-right monarchists, nationalists, and various paramilitary groups, with centrist democratic parties struggling to maintain stability. Though the mid-1920s they brought some economic recovery under the Dawes Plan, the Great Depression of 1929 shattered this fragile equilibrium. Industrial production collapsed, unemployment soared past 6 million, and despair spread through all levels of society. In such conditions, extremist parties gained traction by offering simple explanations and promises of decisive action. The Nazi Party capitalized on this mood, blaming Germany's woes on November criminals, politicians who signed the armistice in 1918. Marxists and, above all, Jews, all portrayed as conspirators undermining the nation from within. The Nazi political strategy before 1933, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, founded in 1920, had been a minor fringe movement for much of the 1920s. Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in 1923 led to his imprisonment, during which he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology and political ambitions. After his release, Hitler shifted tactics. Instead of attempting to seize power through force, he aimed to achieve it legally through elections while still preparing to dismantle democracy once in office. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Nazis built a vast propaganda machine. Joseph Goebbels, as head of Nazi propaganda machine, Joseph Goebbels, as head of Nazi propaganda, skillfully used posters, rallies, and the new medium of radio to portray Hitler as Germany's savior. The party also developed paramilitary wings, the SAA, Sturmabteilung, and later the SS, Schutzstaffel, that intimidated political opponents and gave the Nazis a visible presence on the streets. The Nazis presented themselves as the party of national revival, promising jobs, restored pride, and the overturning of Versailles. By July 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest in the Reichstag, winning 37 of the vote, yet they lacked a majority. 7 of the vote, yet they lacked a majority, and Germany's political system remained deadlocked. President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging war hero, disliked Hitler personally and initially refused to appoint him chancellor. The road to appointment. The months leading up to January 1933 were a period of intense political intrigue. Successive chancellors, Heinrich Brüning, Franz von Papen, and Kurt von Schleicher, failed to build stable governing coalitions. Papen, seeking to regain influence, struck a deal with Hitler and other conservative elites. Hitler would become chancellor, but conservatives believed they could control him by limiting Nazi representation in the cabinet. This proved a fatal miscalculation. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Though only 3 of 11 cabinet members were Nazis, the chancellorship gave Hitler control over the machinery of government. Papen famously declared, "WWII hired him," confident that traditional elites could restrain Hitler's radicalism. History would prove him catastrophically wrong. The Reichstag fire and the destruction of civil liberties once in office. Hitler moved quickly to consolidate power. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, blamed on a Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe, provided the Nazis with a pretext to crush political opposition. Whether or not the Nazis themselves orchestrated the fire remains debated, but they exploited it ruthlessly. The next day, President Hindenburg, at Hitler's urging, issued the Reichstag fire decree. This emergency measure suspended key civil liberties, including freedom of speech, press, assembly, and privacy of communication. It authorized the arrest of political opponents without specific charges. Thousands of communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and other critics were imprisoned in makeshift detention centers. The first steps toward the concentration camp system. The March elections and the Enabling Act Hitler called new elections for March 5, 1933, hoping to secure a parliamentary majority. The campaign was marked by unprecedented violence and intimidation, with SA members disrupting opposition rallies and Nazi propaganda dominating public space. Despite these tactics, the Nazis won only 43.9% of the vote, short of a majority. They formed a coalition with the German National People's Party, DNVP, to control the Reichstag. The real turning point came on March 23, 1933, when the Reichstag passed the enabling act Gesetz zur Behebung der Von-Völkern-Reich. This law effectively gave Hitler dictatorial powers, allowing his cabinet to enact laws without parliamentary approval or presidential consent. Opposition deputies were harassed and in many cases physically prevented from voting. Communist deputies were already arrested, and many social democrats were absent or intimidated, with the Center Party and others persuaded or coerced into support. The act passed by the required two-thirds majority. German democracy was now dead in all but name. Gleichschaltung. The coordination of all institutions with the enabling act in place, the Nazis embarked on Gleichschaltung, coordination, a sweeping process as of bringing all aspects of German life alignment with ideology. State governments were replaced with Nazi-appointed governors, independent trade unions were dissolved and replaced with the German Labor Front, and cultural organizations were purged of un-German elements. The press was censored, opposition parties banned, and political dissent criminalized. The SA and SS expanded their role, terrorizing opponents and enforcing conformity. Early concentration camps, such as Dachau, opened in March 1933, became sites where political prisoners were beaten, tortured, and sometimes killed. The judiciary, civil service, education system, and police forces were coordinated to serve Nazi goals. The exclusion of Jews from public life, anti-Semitism, always central to Nazi ideology, quickly became state policy. In April 1933, the regime organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. Enforced by SA pickets, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service barred Jews and political opponents from government employment, including teaching, law, and the judiciary. Similar laws targeted Jewish doctors, lawyers, and academics, pushing them out of public life. Though these early measures were not yet the full-scale persecution of later years, they marked a decisive shift. Anti-Semitism was no longer just propaganda. It was the law of the land. This legal discrimination also tested public reaction, and the muted response from most Germans encouraged the regime to push further. Propaganda and the cult of the Führer throughout 1933. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda cultivated the image of Hitler as the Führer, the embodiment of the German people's will. Mass rallies, radio broadcasts, and orchestrated public events reinforced a narrative of national rebirth under Nazi leadership. The Nazis linked every success, from job creation programs to foreign policy defiance, to Hitler's personal vision. This cult of personality would become a central pillar of Nazi rule, binding the population to the regime through emotional loyalty as much as through fear. The suppression of opposition. By the end of 1933, all political opposition in Germany had been eliminated. The Communist Party KPD was outlawed. The Social Democratic Party SPD banned, and other political parties either dissolved themselves or were forcibly disbanded. Independent organizations, from youth groups to sports clubs, were absorbed into Nazi structures. Germany had become a one-party state. Terror was systematic. The Gestapo, secret state police, emerged as a feared instrument of repression, operating outside legal constraints. Ordinary Germans learned quickly that dissent, even private criticism, could lead to arrest. The Nazis' consolidation of power thus relied on a combination of legal authority, paramilitary violence, propaganda manipulation, and the silencing of all opposition voices. International reaction abroad. The Nazi seizure of power was met with a mix of alarm and hesitation. Some foreign observers recognized the danger of Hitler's dictatorship, but others underestimated him, viewing Nazi rule as a temporary or exaggerated response to German unrest. Many hoped that Hitler might moderate once in office, not realizing that his radicalism was not a campaign tool but a core belief system. This misjudgment would have grave consequences in the years to come. The years end a dictatorship in place by December 1933. Less than a year after Hitler became chancellor, the transformation of Germany was essentially complete. The Weimar Republic's democratic institutions had been dismantled, political pluralism destroyed, and a climate of fear and conformity entrenched. The legal framework for Nazi dictatorship was solid, and the first steps toward racial persecution were underway. What remained was to expand and deepen this control, and to prepare Germany, ideologically and materially, for the aggressive expansion and genocidal policies that lay ahead. The Nuremberg laws and the racial ideology that underpin them stand as one of the most chilling legal codifications of prejudice and discrimination in human history, emerging in Nazi Germany in 1935 as the culmination of a long-brewing campaign of anti-Semitism that had been intensifying since Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933, but rooted far deeper in centuries of European prejudice. These laws did not arise in a vacuum. They were the product of a Nazi worldview shaped by pseudoscientific racial theories, distorted notions of racial purity, and the deeply ingrained anti-Semitic myths that had circulated in Europe for generations. The Nazi leadership, particularly Hitler and other senior figures such as Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Julius Streicher, had absorbed and then amplified these ideas, blending them with extreme nationalism and social Darwinism to create a toxic ideology that classified humanity into hierarchical races, with so-called Aryans at the top and Jews, Roma and Gypsies, and others deemed inferior at the bottom. The Nazis claimed that Jews were not merely followers of a religion, but members of a biologically distinct and dangerous race whose supposed influence had to be removed from German life entirely. This ideology was already apparent in Mein Kampf, where Hitler portrayed Jews as the root cause of Germany's defeat in World War I, economic hardships, and moral decline. But the Nazi state sought to transform these prejudices into official and forcible policy. By 1935, anti-Semitic propaganda had saturated the press, radio, education system, and public life, priming the German populace for a decisive legal step that would formalize the separation of Jews from Aryan Germans. The occasion for this codification came during the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg in September 1935, a grand propaganda spectacle meant to display the unity and power of the Third Reich. On September 15th, in the midst of the rally, the Reichstag convened specially in Nuremberg rather than Berlin, passed two laws that would become known collectively as the Nuremberg Laws: the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, and the Reich Citizenship Law. The first prohibited marriages and extramarital relations between Jews and persons of German or related blood, claiming that such relationships would contaminate the purity of the Aryan race. It also forbade Jews from employing German women under the age of 45 as domestic servants, based on the baseless fear that sexual relations might occur. The second law stripped Jews of German citizenship, relegating them to the status of mere subjects of the state, thereby depriving them of political rights such as voting or holding public office. These measures were not merely symbolic. They had profound, immediate effects, removing Jews from the legal community of the German nation and setting the stage for escalating persecution. Yet the laws themselves did not fully define who was a Jew, leading to the issuance of supplementary decrees over the next few months that codified racial definitions based on ancestry rather than religious belief. Under these decrees, anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was classified as a Jew regardless of personal faith or self-identification, while those with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents were labeled Mischlinge, mixed bloods, and placed in legally ambiguous categories that still carried many restrictions. This pseudo-scientific classification system, relying on family records, synagogue registers, and baptismal certificates, revealed the obsessive bureaucratic precision with which the Nazi state sought to police racial boundaries. The implementation of the Nuremberg Laws was accompanied by intensified propaganda efforts, with newspapers such as Dermer running lurid and dehumanizing caricatures of Jews, schools introducing racially based curricula, and public signs declaring Jews not wanted here, or Jews forbidden. The ideological justification for these measures rested on the Nazi belief in racial struggle as the driving force of history, a warped interpretation of Darwin's theory of evolution that saw different races locked in an eternal battle for survival and dominance. In this framework, Jews were portrayed as a parasitic, corrosive element, seeking to weaken and dominate host nations through alleged control of finance, media, and culture, accusations entirely devoid of factual basis, but made believable to many Germans through relentless repetition. This racial ideology was also tied to the broader Nazi vision of a Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, in which unity and purity could only be achieved by excluding those deemed alien or inferior. The Nuremberg Laws thus served both a practical and symbolic purpose. Practically, they provided a legal basis for excluding Jews from public life, the professions, and the German nation. Symbolically, They signaled to the populace that anti-Semitism was not just a matter of personal prejudice, but an official, state-sanctioned duty. The effect on the Jewish community in Germany was devastating. Many Jews who had served in the German army during World War I, who considered themselves patriotic Germans, now found themselves branded as outsiders in the land of their birth. Interfaith couples faced enormous pressures, with marriages either annulled or socially ostracized, and die-Mischlinge. Children found themselves caught between identities, often facing bullying, discrimination, and uncertainty about their future. Economic consequences were severe as well. Jews were progressively excluded from practicing law, medicine, and other professions. Their businesses boycotted or forcibly Aryanized, taken over by non-Jewish Germans, often at far below market value. The laws also emboldened acts of everyday harassment and violence, as ordinary Germans, encouraged by official rhetoric, felt free to insult, assault, or otherwise mistreat Jews without fear of legal consequences. International reaction to the Nuremberg laws was mixed. While many foreign governments condemned them, the response was largely diplomatic and lacked concrete measures to pressure Germany into reversing course. Some international observers failed to grasp the radical and dangerous implications, assuming that this was the peak of Nazi anti-Semitism rather than a prelude to far worse. In reality, the Nuremberg laws laid the groundwork for the Holocaust by embedding racial discrimination into the very fabric of the German legal system, ensuring that when mass deportations and exterminations began a few years later, they could be justified as the logical extension of established policy. Furthermore, these laws became a model for other Nazi-allied or occupied states, which adopted similar racial definitions and restrictions. The Nuremberg laws also had a deeply corrosive psychological effect, reinforcing the idea that Jews were inherently separate and irredeemable, thus making later atrocities seem, in the eyes of many Germans, both acceptable and inevitable. The racial ideology they embodied was not limited to Jews. It also targeted Roma, people of African descent, and others. But anti-Semitism was its most developed and venomous expression. This ideology was reinforced through the SS and other Nazi institutions, which trained members in racial theory, genealogy, and the supposed dangers of racial mixing. The Nuremberg laws thus represent a chilling intersection of ideology and bureaucracy, demonstrating how prejudice can be dressed in the language of law and science to give it a veneer of legitimacy. They were not merely an aberration in German history, but a stark warning of how legal systems can be manipulated to enforce inhuman policies when guided by extremist ideology, by reducing citizenship to a racial privilege and defining identity by blood rather than choice. The Nazi state stripped millions of people of their rights, dignity, and ultimately their lives. The legacy of these laws endures as a grim reminder that the path to genocide is often paved with laws, decrees, and regulations that may appear, at first, to be orderly or administrative, but in fact serve as the infrastructure of oppression. They demonstrate that the Holocaust was not simply the result of wartime chaos, but the outcome of deliberate, calculated steps taken years in advance to isolate, dehumanize, and eliminate an entire people. The event known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, stands as one of the most infamous turning points in the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany, occurring on the nights of November 9th and 10th, 1938. It marked a violent shift from state-sanctioned discrimination and legal repression to outright physical assault and destruction on a massive scale. Before Kristallnacht, the Nazi regime had already implemented numerous anti-Jewish measures, such as the Nuremberg laws, economic boycotts, and social exclusion. Jews were removed from public service, barred from professions, and stripped of many civil rights. Yet despite this legal onslaught, many Jewish families still lived in their homes, ran their businesses, and tried to maintain some semblance of community life. Though increasingly isolated, the attack in November 1938 shattered that fragile balance. It was not only the destruction of property, synagogues, shops, cemeteries, and homes, but also the state's willingness to unleash open violence on its Jewish citizens without fear of consequence. The shattered glass that littered German and Austrian streets the next morning symbolized the destruction of Jewish life in Central Europe, and it sent a clear signal to Jews, Germans, and the world. The Nazis were no longer merely legislating prejudice. They were unleashing it in its raw, brutal form. The immediate trigger for Kristallnacht was the assassination of Ernst von Rath, a German diplomat stationed in Paris, by Herschel Greenspan. A 17-year-old Polish Jew, Greenspan's act was born of desperation. His family, along with thousands of other Polish Jews, had been expelled from Germany in late October 1938 and left stranded at the border in horrific conditions. Greenspan, living in Paris, learned of their suffering and, in a moment of anger and despair, went to the German embassy on November 7, 1938, and shot von Rath, who succumbed to his injuries 2 days later. The Nazi leadership seized upon this act as the pretext they had been waiting for, a chance to justify an organized, large-scale attack on the Jewish community. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda and one of Hitler's closest allies, quickly framed the assassination not as the isolated act of a desperate youth, but as part of an international Jewish conspiracy against Germany. This framing was crucial in turning public sentiment, or at least public compliance, toward acceptance of what would come. The night of November 9th, 1938, coincided with the annual gathering of Nazi leaders in Munich to commemorate the anniversary of the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. Hitler, after receiving news of von Rath's death, conferred with Goebbels and other high-ranking officials. Goebbels gave a fiery speech to party leaders, suggesting that spontaneous demonstrations against Jews should be allowed to erupt throughout Germany and Austria. Though framed as spontaneous, these actions were, in reality, carefully coordinated. Orders were sent to Nazi officials, the SA Sturmabteilung, the SS Schutzstaffel, the SA Sturmabteilung, the SS Schutzstaffel, and police units, instructing them to carry out attacks but to avoid direct intervention to protect Jewish property or lives. Police were told explicitly not to interfere unless Aryan property was threatened. Fire brigades were ordered not to extinguish burning synagogues unless adjacent non-Jewish buildings were endangered. In this way, the state created the appearance of public outrage while ensuring the violence proceeded with official approval and logistical support. What followed was one of the most destructive pogroms in modern history. As night fell, Nazi stormtroopers, Hitler Youth members, SS men, and other loyalists swept through cities, towns, and villages. Synagogues were set ablaze across the Reich, ancient houses of worship. Some centuries old, were reduced to ashes. Jewish-owned shops and department stores were smashed open. Their windows shattered into jagged piles that gave the pogrom its name. Merchandise was looted or destroyed. In many cases, attackers desecrated Torah, scrolls, and religious artifacts, dragging them into the streets before burning them. Jewish cemeteries were vandalized, gravestones toppled, and graves desecrated. In private homes, furniture was smashed, toppled, and graves desecrated. In private homes, furniture was smashed, belongings thrown into the streets, and residents beaten. The violence was accompanied by humiliation. Jews were sometimes forced into the streets, made to perform degrading acts, or subjected to verbal abuse before being arrested. The brutality was not limited to property. Dozens of Jews were murdered outright, while others died from injuries sustained during the assaults. The human toll was staggering, not only in lives lost but in the terror inflicted. Official German figures at the time admitted to at least 91 deaths, but historians believe the true number was much higher. Given that many victims later died from injuries or from mistreatment in concentration camps, over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested in the immediate aftermath and sent to concentration camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. These mass arrests targeted the male population deliberately, leaving families without their primary breadwinners and further destabilizing Jewish communities. Inside the camps, detainees were beaten, subjected to forced labor, and pressured to emigrate from Germany as soon as possible on the condition that they surrender their property to the state. The message was unmistakable. Jews had no future in Nazi Germany, and those who remained risked death. The destruction of property was equally severe. More than 400 synagogues and prayer halls were destroyed or heavily damaged. Around 500 Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized, looted, or destroyed. Private homes, schools, and community centers suffered the same fate. The shattered glass from shop windows that littered the streets in the morning became the defining image of Kristallnacht. But for Jews, the more enduring reality was the loss of security, dignity, and hope. These attacks were not simply expressions of mob hatred. They were coordinated, state-orchestrated acts designed to accelerate the removal of Jews from German life. The pogrom marked the end of any illusions that Jews might retain a place in the Reich through quiet endurance or assimilation. International reaction to Kristallnacht was one of shock and condemnation. News of the destruction spread rapidly through newspapers and radio broadcasts, with graphic descriptions and photographs reaching audiences across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. In the United States, Britain, France, and other countries, protests were organized and government officials issued statements of outrage. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recalled the American ambassador from Berlin, an unprecedented diplomatic move at the time. Though the United States did not sever relations with Germany, Britain expedited the Kindertransport program, which allowed thousands of Jewish children to find refuge with foster families in the UK. Yet, despite the widespread condemnation, immigration policies in most countries remained restrictive, leaving the vast majority of Jews trapped within Nazi territory. The gap between moral outrage and practical assistance was painfully clear for the Nazi regime. International criticism was of little concern. If anything, the leadership viewed the tepid global response as a green light for further radicalization of anti-Jewish policy. Kristallnacht had demonstrated that open, violent persecution could be carried out without significant consequences from the international community. Domestically, the pogrom had several immediate effects that deepened Jewish suffering. Jewish communities were fined collectively for the damages of perverse twist that forced the victims to pay for the destruction inflicted upon them. The fine totaled 1 billion Reichsmarks, a staggering sum that crippled whatever economic resilience Jewish families might have had left. Insurance payouts for damaged properties were confiscated by the state. Jews were barred from owning businesses or shops, from attending cinemas or concerts, from using public parks, and from attending German schools. This comprehensive exclusion from public life marked a decisive step toward the complete social, economic, and physical removal of Jews from Germany. In the months that followed Kristallnacht, Jewish emigration surged, but it was fraught with obstacles. Many countries, still in the grip of the Great Depression and bound by immigration quotas, were reluctant to accept large numbers of refugees. The Evian Conference of July 1938 had already shown that the world's willingness to aid Jews was limited after Kristallnacht. Desperation increased, but opportunities remained scarce. For those who stayed, the situation grew ever more perilous. The concentration camps, initially used for political prisoners and dissenters, now held increasing numbers of Jews. These facilities became sites of both punishment and coercion, where detainees were told they could secure release by proving they had secured passage abroad again, contingent on surrendering most of their assets. Thus, Kristallnacht not only inflicted immediate terror, but also accelerated the machinery of dispossession and exile. From a historical perspective, Kristallnacht is often seen as a bridge between the earlier phase of Nazi anti-Jewish policy marked by legal discrimination and social marginalization and the later phase of systematic annihilation. It was a moment when violence was normalized, when the state openly endorsed physical attacks on Jews, and when the public was made complicit, whether through participation, passive observation, or willful ignorance. The broken glass, burned synagogues, and desecrated cemeteries were not just acts of destruction. They were declarations that Jewish life had no place in the new Germany. The pogrom's orchestration also revealed the Nazi regime's mastery of blending propaganda, bureaucratic coordination, and paramilitary action into a seamless instrument of terror. By framing the violence as a spontaneous outpouring of public anger over a diplomat's murder, the Nazis could deny direct responsibility while ensuring maximum impact. In the long arc of the Holocaust, Kristallnacht was both a culmination and a beginning. It culminated years of escalating anti-Semitism and legal persecution, demonstrating the regime's readiness to translate ideology into physical destruction. At the same time, it marked the beginning of a new, more ruthless phase in which the use of organized, state-backed violence against Jews would become commonplace, paving the way for the ghettos, deportations, and extermination camps that would follow for the Jews who survived that night. The sound of shattering glass was more than a noise. It was the death knell of any remaining belief that they could endure Nazi rule unharmed. For the perpetrators and bystanders, it was a signal that there were no limits to what could be done to the Jews with impunity. Kristallnacht's legacy is thus inseparable from the history of the Holocaust as a whole. It remains a stark reminder that genocide does not erupt suddenly. It grows in stages, moving from words to laws, from laws to violence, and from violence to mass murder. The night of broken glass showed how quickly the boundary between persecution and physical annihilation can be crossed when hatred is fueled by ideology, propaganda, and state power. The fragments of glass that covered the streets in November 1938 have long since been swept away, but their meaning endures. They warn us of the fragility of civilization, the ease with which neighbors can turn on one another, and the necessity of confronting hatred before it shatters lives beyond repair. The Nazi regime's creation of ghettos during the Holocaust represented one of the most systematic and chilling stages in their campaign against Europe's Jewish population. The policy of ghettoization, which emerged in full force after the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, was rooted in centuries-old anti-Semitic traditions, but elevated to unprecedented levels of brutality and control by the machinery of the modern state. To the Nazi leadership, the ghettos were more than physical spaces. They were instruments of segregation, economic exploitation, social degradation, and, ultimately, an essential step in the process of extermination. In these confined urban districts, Jews were forcibly removed from the broader population and concentrated in overcrowded, disease-ridden conditions. Nazi propaganda portrayed these measures as security or public health necessities, masking their true purpose: to strip Jewish communities of autonomy, dignity, and life itself. The ghettos served as a critical stage between the initial discrimination and violence of the early Nazi years and the mass deportations to extermination. Camps that defined the final solution. Their story is therefore not only one of physical confinement, but of the calculated destruction of human beings through deprivation, humiliation, and despair. The ghetto policy evolved in different phases, reflecting both ideological objectives and the shifting circumstances of the war. Before World War II, Nazi anti-Semitic measures in Germany had already restricted Jewish rights through the Nuremberg laws, professional bans, and Aryanization of businesses. However, Jews still lived within broader German society, albeit marginalized and increasingly impoverished. The invasion of Poland in 1939 brought millions of Jews under German control almost overnight, creating a Jewish question on a massive scale in towns and cities across occupied Poland. Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow, Lublin, and many others. The Germans began issuing orders for Jews to relocate to designated districts. The first ghettos were established in late 1939 and early 1940. Often sealed with walls, barbed wire, Oregon armed patrols. Although the Nazis sometimes claimed ghettos were temporary holding areas before resettlement, in reality they were designed to sever Jews from social and economic life, to facilitate the confiscation of their property, and to weaken them physically and psychologically. Life inside the ghettos was marked by extraordinary overcrowding. In Warsaw, for instance, over 400,000 Jews were crammed into an area of just 4 square kilometers, resulting in densities of more than 7 people per room. Streets were clogged with makeshift stalls, children playing amid rubble, and people carrying bundles in search of scarce food. Housing was dilapidated, often with broken windows, leaking roofs, and inadequate heating. Sanitation facilities were grossly insufficient. Sewage often ran in open gutters, contributing to the rapid spread of disease. Typhus epidemics, fueled by lice and the inability to obtain proper medical care, claimed thousands of lives. Hunger was a daily torment. Official German food rations for Jews were deliberately set far below subsistence levels, sometimes as little as 184 calories per day in Warsaw, forcing people to rely on smuggling, barter, or the meager aid provided by Jewish welfare organizations. Children were often the primary smugglers, slipping through cracks in walls or bribing guards to bring in bread, potatoes, or a few scraps of meat. Despite these harsh conditions, the ghettos were not devoid of life, resilience, or cultural expression. In many places, Jewish councils Judenräte were established under German orders to manage the ghettos. Internal administration. The Judenrat was tasked with implementing German decrees, distributing food, organizing labor brigades, and maintaining some semblance of order. While some council members tried to shield their communities, others found themselves compromised or corrupted by their proximity to German power. Alongside the Judenrat, underground networks worked to maintain education, religious life, and cultural traditions. Secret schools operated in basements, teachers risking their lives to provide lessons in mathematics, literature, and Hebrew. Rabbis conducted clandestine prayer services and holiday observances, preserving spiritual life in defiance of Nazi prohibitions. Theater performances, concerts, and literary readings, though often tinged with irony, satire, or quiet despair, offered psychological relief and a reaffirmation of humanity. Economic life in the ghettos was shaped by both exploitation and ingenuity. The Nazis used ghetto labor for their own benefit, contracting Jewish workers to produce goods for the German war effort, from uniforms and boots to armaments components. In Łódź, the ghetto became an enormous forced labor camp under the authority of Chaim Rumkowski, its controversial Judenrat chairman, who believed that making the ghetto indispensable to the Germans could save lives. While this policy prolonged the ghetto's existence, it also meant acquiescing to unbearable working conditions and the deportation of the sick, elderly, and children deemed unproductive free. In other ghettos, small-scale markets emerged, despite strict prohibitions. Smuggling was so pervasive in Warsaw that entire underground economies developed, involving complex networks of Jewish traders, Polish intermediaries, and even corrupt German officials. Yet such survival strategies were dangerous. Smuggling could result in beatings, imprisonment, or summary execution. The psychological impact of ghetto life was profound. Isolation from the outside world created a sense of abandonment, as news of the war filtered in only sporadically and often distorted by rumor. Many residents clung to hope that the war would end before their situation became irreversible. Others recognized early on that the ghettos were not temporary, but part of a larger extermination plan. Family life was under constant strain as hunger eroded strength and disease claimed loved ones. The death of children, whether from starvation, illness, or German violence, was particularly devastating. Yet tragically common, funerals became daily occurrences. Cemeteries filled at alarming rates. For some, despair led to resignation or even suicide. For others, the misery fueled acts of resistance. Both passive and active resistance in the ghettos took many forms. From the preservation of cultural identity to armed uprisings, the most famous was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April-May 1943, in which poorly armed Jewish fighters held off German forces for nearly a month, preferring to die in combat rather than be sent to the gas chambers. Earlier, smaller acts of defiance hiding people in cellars, forging identity papers, or sabotaging German orders were equally significant in their assertion of agency. Underground archives, such as the Oyneg Shebs group in Warsaw, documented daily life, preserving testimonies, photographs, and drawings that would later serve as vital historical evidence of Nazi crimes. By 1942, the ghetto's role shifted decisively as the Nazis implemented the final solution. With the launch of Operation Reinhard, ghettos across occupied Poland were systematically emptied, their residents deported to extermination camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Babuik. Deportations were often preceded by selections in which German officers and their collaborators decided who would be sent to immediate death and who would be temporarily spared for labor. The process was brutal, involving beatings, shootings, and the terror of families being torn apart. The liquidation of the ghettos marked the end of a chapter in Jewish life that, while defined by suffering, had also been a period of remarkable endurance and creativity in the face of annihilation. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the ghettos came to symbolize both the depths of Nazi cruelty and the resilience of those who endured them. Survivors' testimonies have ensured that the memory of ghetto life is not reduced to statistics or faceless suffering, but remains a record of individual lives, of parents who starved so their children might eat, of children who risked death to smuggle bread, of neighbors who shared what little they had. These stories challenge simplistic narratives of victimhood by revealing the complex moral and practical choices people faced in impossible circumstances. The ghettos were, in essence, crucibles of human endurance, where survival itself became an act of defiance against a regime determined to erase an entire people. Understanding them is essential not only to the history of the Holocaust, but to the broader history of human resilience under tyranny. The German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, stands as the event that not only ignited the Second World War, but also marked the beginning of the Holocaust's first large-scale phase of systematic terror and persecution. This invasion was not merely a military campaign aimed at territorial conquest. It was conceived from the outset as a war of annihilation, grounded in the racial ideology of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist leadership. Poland, in Nazi racial thinking, was to serve as a vast colonial territory for the expansion of the so-called Aryan race, and its population was to be reorganized, exploited, and, in large part, destroyed. As Wehrmacht units surged across the border from Germany in the west and from Slovakia in the south, they were soon joined by Soviet forces from the east after the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was put into effect on September 17th, dividing Poland between the two totalitarian powers. For the Polish people, and particularly for the country's 3 million Jews, the invasion ushered in an era of unprecedented brutality that intertwined military conquest with ideological extermination. From the first days of the campaign, the German military, and the SS, especially Einsatzgruppen Mobile Killing Squad, began targeting not just Polish soldiers but also civilians, with a special emphasis on intellectuals, clergy, political leaders, and Jewish communities. Hitler had made it clear in private conferences before the war began that this would not be a conventional conflict bound by the rules of the Hague Conventions. Rather, it would be a campaign of racial cleansing and subjugation. The military orders handed down to German troops included instructions to act with unrestrained severity, particularly against those deemed racially or politically undesirable, as the Luftwaffe bombed Warsaw and other cities into submission. Terror from the air combined with massacres on the ground to produce a psychological shock that would aid in the quick collapse of organized resistance. Yet the swiftness of the German victory was not merely the result of superior military tactics such as blitzkrieg. It was also a product of the moral vacuum created by the calculated dehumanization of the Polish population. In the immediate aftermath of conquest, Nazi authorities moved quickly to implement measures that would shatter the existing social and political order. The German Plan, codenamed Generalplan Ost, envisioned the eventual elimination or enslavement of most of the Polish population, with the western territories annexed to the Reich to be resettled by ethnic Germans. The central portion of Poland became the so-called general government under Hans Frank, who would administer it as a colonial hinterland, stripped of resources and ruled by terror. From the very first weeks, Jews were singled out for humiliating decrees. They were forced to wear identifying armbands or badges, subjected to arbitrary arrests, forced labor, and violent pogroms often carried out with the tacit or explicit approval of German soldiers and police. The Nazis also dismantled Polish cultural life, closing schools, banning newspapers, and arresting writers, professors, and priests. This was not incidental brutality, it was the deliberate destruction of a nation's intellectual and spiritual backbone, intended to render resistance impossible and to pave the way for German domination. The Soviet occupation of eastern Poland, while ideologically different in its justifications, was no less devastating for many Poles. Under Stalin's orders, the NKVD targeted Polish military officers, civil servants, landowners, and members of the intelligentsia for arrest, deportation, or execution, or execution, or execution. The infamous Katyn massacre of 1940, in which thousands of Polish officers were murdered, was one of the most notorious outcomes of this policy. Jewish communities in the Soviet zone experienced a complex fate. They were spared the immediate onslaught of Nazi exterminatory measures, but they faced suppression of religious life, the dismantling of communal institutions, and, for some, deportation to the Soviet interior. The division of Poland thus created two parallel systems of oppression: un-Nazi, openly genocidal from the outset, and one Soviet, rooted in class warfare and political purges. Both systems inflicted deep wounds that would shape the Polish wartime experience. In the German zone, the role of the Einsatzgruppen became a grim hallmark of the invasion's aftermath. These units, operating closely with the Wehrmacht and local auxiliary forces, embarked on mass shootings, particularly in small towns and rural areas. Jewish men were often rounded up under the pretense of labor recruitment, only to be shot on the outskirts of town, their bodies buried in hastily dug pits. Such massacres served a dual purpose. They eliminated perceived enemies and terrorized the surviving population into submission. By the winter of 1939-40, tens of thousands of Polish civilians, including many Jews, had been killed in such operations. The brutality was not hidden. In fact, it was often staged in ways that maximized public intimidation. Forced public humiliations, beatings, and the destruction of synagogues became routine. This was the expansion of terror in its most literal sense, terror not as a byproduct of war, but as an instrument of policy. The German occupation authorities also began experimenting with ghettoization during this period. In cities like Piotrków-Trybunalski, Jews were forced into confined districts, cut off from the rest of the population, and subjected to severe shortages of food, medicine, and basic services. The ghetto system, which would become a central feature of Nazi policy across occupied Eastern Europe, had its roots in these early months of the Polish occupation. The Nazis understood that isolating Jews physically and economically would not only weaken them as a community, but also prepare the logistical groundwork for future deportations and mass killings. German propaganda portrayed these measures as necessary for public health and order, reinforcing anti-Semitic stereotypes that depicted Jews as dangerous outsiders. At the same time, The occupation administration confiscated Jewish property on a massive scale, enriching the Reich and rewarding collaborators while impoverishing the victims. The scale of the terror was not limited to the Jews, however. Polish political prisoners filled makeshift detention centers and newly established concentration camps, such as Stutthof and Auschwitz, originally built to hold Polish political detainees before becoming the primary site of the Holocaust. Collective reprisals became standard practice. If partisans or resistors attacked a German soldier, entire villages could be burned and their inhabitants executed. German racial ideology dictated that Slavic Poles were an inferior race, unworthy of self-determination, and this belief justified in the minds of Nazi leaders the use of the harshest measures without concern for international law. Hans Frank himself infamously stated that the Poles were to be treated as slaves of the German people, and that the Polish lands are a gift from God to the German race. These statements were not rhetorical flourishes. They were operational directives. In the countryside, the economic exploitation of Poland was organized with ruthless efficiency. Food requisitioning stripped Polish farmers of their harvests, leaving many communities on the brink of starvation, while the proceeds were sent to feed the German army and population. Forced labor drafts sent hundreds of thousands of Poles, including teenagers, to work in German factories under brutal conditions. Jews were often pressed into the most degrading and dangerous forms of labor, from clearing rubble to digging ditches, all under guard and without adequate nourishment. The combination of starvation, overwork, and exposure to the elements claimed countless lives even before the Nazis began implementing systematic extermination in death camps. This exploitation was itself a form of slow-motion mass murder, one that the German authorities viewed as both efficient and ideologically satisfying. The Polish invasion also served as a training ground for the Nazi machinery of mass killing, policies, tactics, and bureaucratic structures developed in Poland in 1939-40 would later be applied on a far larger scale in the Soviet Union after 1941. The coordination between the Wehrmacht, SS, Gestapo, and civilian occupation administrations demonstrated that genocide was not the work of a few rogue extremists, but the product of a broad coalition of state institutions. Ordinary German policemen, soldiers, and civil servants were drawn into the process, normalizing mass violence as part of their daily duties. The idea that a final solution to the so-called Jewish question could be achieved through a combination of legal decrees, economic plunder, social isolation, and direct killing took shape in these formative months. By the spring of 1940, Poland had been transformed into a laboratory of oppression. The terror that began with the invasion had expanded into a permanent system of control, one that combined racial ideology with economic exploitation and state violence. For the Jews of Poland, the months following September 1939 marked the transition from discrimination to physical annihilation. For the Polish nation as a whole, they represented the destruction of sovereignty, culture, and security. The invasion of Poland was thus not only the beginning of the Second World War, it was the prologue to the Holocaust itself. The expansion of terror in this context was not a matter of wartime excess, it was the deliberate and premeditated strategy of a regime whose ultimate goal was nothing less than the remaking of Europe along racial lines, no matter how much human life it cost. The story of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units of Nazi Germany, is one of the most chilling episodes in the history of the Holocaust, not only because of the vast numbers of people they murdered, but also because of the intimate, face-to-face nature of their crimes. Unlike the industrialized killing of the extermination camps, which distanced the perpetrators from their victims through machinery and gas chambers, the Einsatzgruppen executed their victims at close range, often in broad daylight with rifles and pistols in fields, forests, ravines, and town squares. Between 1941 and 1943, these units were responsible for the deaths of more than 1 million Jews, as well as tens of thousands of Roma Soviet political commissars, partisans, and other individuals deemed undesirable by Nazi racial ideology. They were not merely soldiers caught up in the chaos of war. They were carefully selected, ideologically indoctrinated, and organized to carry out a program of deliberate mass murder in the territories conquered by the German army, particularly in the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. The origins of the Einsatzgruppen lie in the Nazi regime's fusion of police, military, and intelligence functions into a single apparatus of repression and control. Before the war, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, and Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Main Security Office, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHOC, had already experimented with special action units, Einsatzkommandos, in Austria and Czechoslovakia following the Anschluss and the occupation of the Sudetenland. These early units were tasked with identifying and neutralizing political opponents, seizing records, and consolidating Nazi power. By the time of the invasion of Poland in 1939, the Einsatzgruppen concept had evolved into an organized structure of mobile detachments that followed the German army into newly occupied territories. In Poland, their targets included the political elite, clergy, and Jews, with massacres and deportations serving both to eliminate resistance and to implement racial policies. This experience in Poland served as a grim rehearsal for the far more extensive and deadly operations that would be undertaken in the Soviet Union after. June 1941, when Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in history, the Einsatzgruppen were prepared for a campaign of extermination that went far beyond conventional military objectives. Their mission was spelled out in advance in verbal orders, reinforced by written directives from Heydrich and Himmler. The units were to follow the advancing Wehrmacht, secure the rear areas, and eliminate perceived threats to German control, with a particular focus on Jews, communists, and other groups labeled as enemies of the Reich. The infamous Kommissarbefehl, Commissar Order, instructed that Soviet political commissars captured by the army were to be executed immediately. In practice, this dovetailed with the racial war aims that identified all Jews as potential political enemies and racial contaminants. Unlike in Poland, where the Nazis had initially relied on ghettoization and slower processes of control, in the Soviet Union the Einsatzgruppen were unleashed for immediate, large-scale mass killings. The Einsatzgruppen were divided into 4 main units A, B, C, and D each, attached to one of the major army groups in North, Center, South, and the 11th Army in the South. Einsatzgruppe A, led by Franz Stahlecker, operated in the Baltic states. Einsatzgruppe B, under Arthur Niebe, in Belarus. Einsatzgruppe C, commanded by Otto Rasch, in northern and central Ukraine, and Einsatzgruppe D, led by Otto Ohlendorf, in northern and central Ukraine, and Einsatzgruppe D, led by Otto Ohlendorf, in southern Ukraine, Moldova, and Crimea. Each Einsatzgruppe consisted of several smaller Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos, typically numbering 500 to 1,000 men in total, though they often drew on additional manpower from the Order Police, Ordnungspolizei, Waffen-SS units, and locally recruited auxiliaries. These auxiliaries, drawn from Latvian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and other collaborationist formations, played a critical role in enabling the scale of the killings, both by augmenting manpower and by lending a veneer of local involvement to what was in essence a German-directed operation. From the very first days of the invasion, the killings began in the Lithuanian city of Kovno. Local militias encouraged and armed by the Germans massacred thousands of Jews in late June 1941, with Einsatzgruppe A's officers present to coordinate and record the events. Similar scenes unfolded across Latvia and Estonia as Einsatzgruppe A moved northwards, leaving behind mass graves and depopulated shtetls. In Belarus, Einsatzgruppe B's operations were marked by the systematic destruction of Jewish communities in towns like Minsk, Vitebsk, and Gomel. Often after brief periods of forced labor or humiliation, Einsatzgruppe C, advancing through Ukraine, would perpetrate some of the most infamous massacres of the war, including the killing at Babi Yar Ravine near Kiev in September 1941, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. Einsatzgruppe D's activities in southern Ukraine and Crimea were characterized by an almost unbroken chain of executions, sometimes wiping out entire towns, Jewish populations within hours of arrival. The method of killing was as grim as it was consistent. Victims were typically rounded up under the pretense of relocation or registration, forced to march or ride in trucks to secluded sites, often forests, pits, or ravines, and compelled to strip naked before being shot in small groups. The shootings were carried out at close range, with rifle or pistol fire aimed at the back of the head or neck, a method that minimized blood spray and allowed the next group to be brought forward quickly. In some places, the victims were forced to lie atop the bodies of those already killed, creating a macabre human layering in the pits. The perpetrators often drank heavily to dull their senses, though many testified after the war that they had become accustomed to the work after initial discomfort. Far from being acts of spontaneous brutality, these massacres were organized with military precision, with roles assigned for cordoning off the site, guarding prisoners, shooting, and covering the graves. Detailed reports, the so-called Erinnesmeldungen, operational situation reports, were sent back to Berlin, documenting the numbers killed, sometimes down to the last individual, and justifying the actions in ideological terms. One of the most striking aspects of the Einsatzgruppen's operations was the bureaucratic meticulousness with which they were carried out. The reports compiled by the units, many of which were discovered after the war, reveal a chilling blend of administrative routine and genocidal violence. They list numbers, locations, and categories of victims, alongside assessments of local political conditions, morale, and logistical issues. In these documents, the human beings murdered are reduced to statistics, their deaths presented as accomplishments toward a political and racial goal. This bureaucratic language helped normalize the killings for the perpetrators, framing them as necessary tasks in the service of the Reich rather than as moral atrocities. The psychological dimension of the Einsatzgruppen's work has long been a subject of study. Unlike the later killing centers such as Treblinka or Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the victims were often unknown to the staff and the process was industrialized, the mobile killing units operated in small groups, often interacting directly with their victims before killing them. This direct contact required a level of desensitization and ideological commitment that was fostered through Nazi indoctrination, peer pressure, and the gradual escalation of violence. Testimonies from post-war trials suggest that while some men were initially horrified or repulsed, few refused outright to participate, and those who did were generally reassigned without severe punishment, suggesting that continued participation was largely voluntary, driven by conformity, careerism, or ideological conviction. The impact of the Einsatzgruppen on the communities they targeted was catastrophic and irreversible. Entire centuries-old Jewish communities in the Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine were wiped from the map within months. The killings also targeted Roma communities, political prisoners, and people with disabilities, extending the Nazi program of racial and social purification deep into the conquered territories. By the end of 1941, the Jewish population in areas under Einsatzgruppen control had been reduced by hundreds of thousands, marking a decisive step toward the final solution. Indeed, the Einsatzgruppen's actions demonstrated to Nazi leaders that large-scale, rapid extermination of entire populations was both feasible and, in their eyes, effective, paving the way for the transition to extermination camps and the wider implementation of genocide. The logistical challenges of the killing operations also influenced Nazi policy. The time, manpower, and psychological toll of mass shootings led some officials to seek more efficient methods, which would emerge in the form of gas vans and stationary gas chambers. Nevertheless, the Einsatzgruppen continued their shooting operations into 1943, especially in areas where transport to extermination camps was impractical. Even as the tide of war turned against Germany after the Battle of Stalingrad, these units persisted in their work, often shifting their focus to anti-partisan operations that were, in reality, thinly veiled campaigns against remaining Jews and other targeted groups. After the war, the crimes of the Einsatzgruppen were among the most thoroughly documented atrocities of the Holocaust, thanks in large part to the survival of the operational situation reports and the testimony of both survivors and perpetrators. The Einsatzgruppen trial at Nuremberg in 1947-48 prosecuted 24 senior leaders of these units, resulting in 14 death sentences, all of which 4 were carried out, and several long prison terms. The trial established important legal precedents, affirming that following orders was not a defense for crimes against humanity and that individuals bore personal responsibility for participating in genocidal actions. However, many lower-level members of the Einsatzgruppen escaped justice, returning to civilian life in Germany or elsewhere with little scrutiny. The legacy of the Einsatzgruppen is inseparable from the broader history of the Holocaust. They represent the rawest form of genocidal violence mediated by machines, carried out in open fields rather than behind camp fences, and witnessed by local populations who often played a role as collaborators, bystanders, or, in some cases, rescuers. The ravines and forests where they carried out their massacres remain scarred landscapes, many of them now marked by memorials that bear silent witness to the communities destroyed there. Historians view the Einsatzgruppen not as an aberration but as a central instrument of Nazi policy, embodying the fusion of ideology, state power, and individual choice that made the Holocaust possible. On the icy morning of January 20th, 1942, in a secluded villa on the shore of the Grosser Wannsee, a lake in a quiet, upscale suburb of Berlin, 15 men gathered around a polished table to discuss what their bureaucratic language described as the final solution of the Jewish question. The villa, requisitioned by the SS as a guest house, was an unlikely setting for one of the most consequential meetings of the 20th century. Yet in that elegant dining room, Behind closed doors, high-ranking officials of the SS, the Nazi Party, and key ministries of the German state formalized the coordination of a plan for the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews. This was the Wannsee Conference, an event that in later decades would become emblematic of the cold, administrative nature of genocide, a meeting in which mass murder was discussed not in the language of hatred and rage, but in the precise, clipped terms of population figures, transport logistics, and interdepartmental responsibilities. The conference was convened at the request of Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Main Security Office, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSAC, and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, tall, blonde, and possessed of a chillingly meticulous mind. Heydrich had been entrusted by Hermann Göring with the task of coordinating the final solution, a euphemism for the total annihilation of the Jewish people. The roots of the meeting lay in a directive issued by Göring on July 31st, 1941, authorizing Heydrich to prepare all necessary organizational, practical, and financial measures for the total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. That order came only weeks after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which had unleashed the Einsatzgruppen and seen hundreds of thousands of Jews shot in mass graves. But by late 1941, the Nazi leadership was looking beyond these decentralized shootings toward a continent-wide coordinated program of extermination. The deportations of German, Austrian, and Czech Jews to ghettos in the East had begun. But the question of their ultimate fate and the fate of the millions of Jews in occupied Poland, the Soviet Union, and soon-to-be occupied territories remained to be standardized across the sprawling Nazi empire. The decision to hold the meeting in January 1942 was shaped by several converging factors. First, the United States had entered the war in December 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Hitler's declaration of war on America had effectively globalized the conflict. In his warped logic, this confirmed the Nazi belief in an international Jewish conspiracy controlling both the United States and the Soviet Union, and thus hardened his resolve to destroy the Jews entirely. Second, by the end of 1941, extermination camps such as Schaufenau were already operational. Using gas vans to murder Jews deported from nearby ghettos, construction at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka camps that would form the core of Operation Reinhard was either underway or imminent. Third, tensions between different branches of the Nazi state, particularly between the SS and civilian ministries, had arisen over jurisdiction and procedure in the deportation and killing process. Heydrich intended the conference to settle these disputes, secure the cooperation of all relevant agencies, and leave no doubt that the RSAC would direct the overall program. The guest list for the Wannsee Conference was carefully chosen to represent the key offices whose participation was essential for genocide on a continental scale. Among those present were Adolf Eichmann, head of the RSAC's Jewish Affairs Department, who acted as the meeting's secretary, Dagwald Stuckart, State Secretary in the Ministry of the Interior and co-author of the Nuremberg Laws, Dr. Roland Freisler from the Ministry of Justice, who would later preside over the People's Court, Joseph Buhler, representing the general government in occupied Poland, Martin Luther from the Foreign Office, Otto Hoffmann of the Race and Settlement Main Office, and several SS generals and state secretaries. The mix of police, party, and ministerial officials underscored that the final solution was not to be the work of a single rogue agency, but a coordinated state policy involving every relevant branch of the Nazi regime. Notably absent from the list were Hitler and Himmler. Heydrich, acting with their authority, did not need them to be present to affirm their support. The meeting began at noon, and according to the surviving minutes later known as the Wannsee Protocol, Heydrich opened by outlining the background to the final solution. He reviewed the earlier immigration policy, under which Jews had been encouraged or forced to leave Germany, and declared it no longer feasible in wartime. Instead, the policy had shifted to evacuation to the east, which in reality meant deportation to ghettos, forced labor camps, and extermination sites. Heydrich presented a table showing that approximately 11 million Jews were within reach of Nazi power, including populations in countries not yet conquered or allied, such as Britain, Ireland, and neutral nations like Switzerland and Sweden, an indication of the regime's genocidal ambitions on a global scale. The list was organized by country, with exact population estimates: 3 million in Poland, 5 million in the Soviet Union, 865, 000 in Romania, 330,000 in France, and so forth, this chilling enumeration reduced entire communities to numbers on a page, the better to plan their destruction. Heydrich then explained the plan methodology. Jews fit for work would be sent east in labor columns, separated by gender, with men and women used for road building and other harsh physical tasks under conditions designed to cause high mortality. Those who survived this natural reduction would be treated accordingly, a euphemism that left little doubt among the participants about the intended killings. Jews deemed unfit for labor children. The elderly, the sick would be killed outright. Special mention was made of mixed-blood persons, Mischlinge, and Jews in mixed marriages, whose fate was debated in more detail by Stuckart and others, reflecting the bureaucratic obsession with racial classification that had characterized Nazi policy since 1935. In the general government, Buhler pressed for the extermination process to begin as soon as possible, citing the large concentration of Jews there and the strain their presence allegedly placed on the administration. Throughout the discussion, the language remained bureaucratic, even polite. The minutes contained no coarse invective, no shouting, no moral hesitation, only the detached, coded phrasing of officials accustomed to discussing mass murder as a matter of administrative routine. Terms like evacuation, special treatment, Sonderbehandlung, and final solution concealed the brutal reality of shootings, starvation, and gassing. Eichmann, who took the minutes, would later testify at his trial in Jerusalem that the actual conversation was more explicit than the sanitized version he recorded. He claimed that the participants spoke openly about killing, and that euphemisms were inserted in the written record to maintain secrecy. The significance of the WWII conference has often been misunderstood. It was not the meeting at which the decision to exterminate Europe's Jews was first made. That decision had been taking shape for months, if not years, and was already being implemented in places like the Soviet Union and Chomno. Rather, WWII was about coordination, efficiency, and jurisdiction. It ensured that every relevant branch of the Nazi state understood its role and committed to working with the SSA. It was also a moment of consolidation for Heydrich, who used the occasion to assert the RSA's primacy over the process. In this sense, the conference was emblematic of the way the Holocaust was carried out not solely through the orders of one man at the top, but through the willing cooperation of a broad network of officials, many of whom were career civil servants rather than fanatical ideologues. In the weeks and months following WWII, the machinery of the final solution accelerated. Operation Reinhard, the plan to exterminate the Jews of the general government, was launched in full, with the construction of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka progressing rapidly. Deportations from ghettos in Lublin, Warsaw, and other Polish cities intensified, with trains carrying thousands of Jews daily to the killing centers. The conference had provided the bureaucratic green light for such operations, removing any ambiguity about the ultimate aim. In Western and Southern Europe, deportations to Auschwitz-Birkenau and other camps began to gather pace, coordinated through the Foreign Office and local collaborationist governments. The WWII protocol itself survived the war almost by accident. Of the 30 copies prepared, only one copy, number 16, was found in the files of the Foreign Office in 1947 by American investigators. This document, with its precise lists and euphemistic phrasing, became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the Nuremberg trials and subsequent prosecutions. It provided irrefutable proof that the Nazi leadership had met to plan the extermination of the Jews, and that the process involved multiple branches of government. The minutes also became a key resource for historians seeking to understand the administrative nature of the Holocaust. Here was genocide discussed as policy, not as frenzy. The villa at WWII still stands today, preserved as a memorial and educational center. Visitors can walk through the rooms where the meeting took place, see the table where Heydrich sat, and read the names of the participants' men who, in a few hours' discussion, finalized the framework for one of history's greatest crimes. The quiet beauty of the setting, with the lake outside and the gentle winter light filtering through the windows, only deepens the sense of horror at what was agreed there. The WWII conference endures in public memory, not because it marked the birth of the Holocaust, but because it reveals the mindset of those who carried it out. The blend of ideology, ambition, and bureaucratic efficiency that made genocide possible. It shows that mass murder can be plotted not in dungeons or barracks, but in comfortable dining rooms by men in suits, over coffee and brandy. By the spring of 1942, the Nazi regime had fully entered the phase of industrialized genocide. The ghettos established across occupied Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe were bursting with malnourished, disease-ridden populations. The Einsatzgruppen had already murdered hundreds of thousands through mass shootings, and the SS leadership had drawn the chilling conclusion that the most efficient way to annihilate the remaining Jews of Europe was through a network of stationary killing centers. These facilities, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Majdanek, were designed not as labor camps but as extermination sites. Their sole purpose to kill human beings on a scale unprecedented in history. To feed this machinery of death, the Nazis needed to empty the ghettos, round up Jews from towns and villages across the continent, and transport them to the camps in a steady, organized flow. Thus began the great wave of deportations to death camps, a process so vast and methodical that it became one of the defining features of the Holocaust. The machinery of deportation relied on a bureaucratic and logistical network that stretched from the smallest rural police station to the highest offices. Of the Reich, orders originated in the Reich Main Security Office, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSH-Sicherheitshauptamt, RSH, where Adolf Eichmann's department IVB 4 oversaw Jewish affairs. Eichmann's team coordinated with local German occupation authorities, the SS and police leaders in each region, and, crucially, with the Reich Ministry of Transport. The Deutsche Reichsbahn, Germany's national railway, became an indispensable partner in genocide, providing the rolling stock, timetables, and scheduling that allowed tens of thousands of people to be moved across hundreds of miles to their deaths. To the railway clerks, these were simply special trains, Sonderzuge, booked and billed like any other, with invoices sent to the Jewish Council's Judenräte, or occupation authorities, for payment, often charging the victims for their own journey to the gas chambers. From the ghettos, the deportations began under the guise of resettlement. Nazi propaganda told Jews they were being moved to work camps in the East, where they would find better conditions. In Warsaw, for example, when the first mass deportations to Treblinka began in July 1942, German announcements claimed that those selected were going to be employed in agricultural labor. The Judenrat, under duress, was ordered to supply daily quotas of people for the transports, and Jewish police forces, many acting under extreme coercion, helped round up the old, the sick, children, and anyone without work permits. Entire families were marched through the streets to the Umschlagplatz, the assembly point near the railway, where they waited for hours or days before being crammed into freight cars. The journey itself was a prelude to death. In the sealed cattle cars, with no windows, no food, and no water, conditions were deliberately engineered to cause maximum suffering. In summer, heat turned the cars into ovens. In winter, cold froze the passengers, breath to the walls. A transport from the Lodz ghetto to Chelmno in January 1942 left hundreds dead upon arrival, frozen where they sat or collapsed from suffocation. The dead were removed alongside the living at the destination, their bodies discarded without ceremony. In some cases, the corpses were left in the cars until they could be buried in mass graves or cremated with the rest of the victims. Survivors of such transports recalled the moans of the dying, the cries of children, and the choking stench of human waste, a mobile hell that broke the spirit even before the train reached its terminus. Each death camp had its own intake procedures, but the pattern was horrifyingly similar. At Treblinka, trains rolled in on a sidetrack concealed by fencing and foliage. Victims were herded from the cars by shouting guards, SS men in black or field gray uniforms, and their auxiliaries in Eastern European uniforms, while dogs barked and whips cracked. They were told to leave their belongings on the platform, often reassured that they would retrieve them later. At Sobibor and Belzec, signs and false railway clocks created the illusion of a normal station. In some cases, a fake ticket office reinforced the deception. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, arriving Jews underwent a selection process. SS doctors and officers directed those deemed fit for work to one side, while the rest, the elderly, women with young children, the sick, were sent directly to the gas chambers. In the Operation Reinhard camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, there was no selection for labor. Virtually everyone on the transport was killed within hours of arrival. The deportations unfolded in waves, each tied to broader Nazi policy decisions. The first large-scale phase began in late 1941 and early 1942, targeting Jews in the Lodz ghetto, sent to Chelmno, and in the Lublin district, sent to Belzec. By mid-1942, the plan expanded into Großsachsen Warschau, the Warsaw ghetto deportations, during which over 250 000 Jews were sent to Treblinka in less than 2 months. Similar operations took place in Białystok, Radom, Czestochowa, and scores of smaller ghettos, systematically clearing entire districts. From occupied France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, Jews were gathered in transit camps such as Drancy, Westerbork, and Mechelen, then shipped east, mostly to Auschwitz-Birkenau. From Greece, long trains carried Jews from Salonika for days across the Balkans. From Italy, transports departed from Fossoli and Bolzano. From Slovakia, from Sered and Zelina. Even from the Channel Islands, British territory occupied by Germany, a handful of Jews were deported via France to Auschwitz. This vast operation required not only German manpower but also the active or passive cooperation of local authorities, police and railway systems. In Vichy, France, French police rounded up Jews in the notorious raffles, including the WWII roundup of July 1942, when over 13,000 Jews, including more than 4,000 children, were detained in appalling conditions in a Paris sports stadium before being deported to Auschwitz. In the Netherlands, the Dutch railways and police facilitated the near-total destruction of the Jewish population, with only a small percentage surviving. In Hungary, following the German occupation in March 1944, the deportations were carried out with astonishing speed. In just 8 weeks, over 430,000 Jews were transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where most were killed on arrival. For the SS, the deportations were a logistical triumph. Trains ran on time, quotas were met, and the camps received a steady flow of victims. For the victims, they were the final betrayal, the last step in a long chain of dehumanization. Many had endured years of ghetto life, clinging to the hope that compliance with German orders might mean survival. The promise of resettlement was often believed, or at least half believed, until the moment the train doors slammed shut. The shock of arrival at the camps, the speed with which families were torn apart, and the immediacy of death left little time for comprehension. Behind this process lay an ideology that fused racial hatred with cold administrative efficiency. The deportations were not random or chaotic. They were the product of months of planning, timetabling, and coordination among multiple branches of the Nazi state. Each transport represented the convergence of anti-Semitic law, police power, railway scheduling, and the genocidal mission of the SSS. The same techniques and bureaucratic procedures could be applied in Paris or in a remote Polish shtetl, in Thessaloniki or in Amsterdam. This universality of method ensured that the system could be scaled up to encompass the whole of Nazi-controlled Europe. By the end of 1944, the deportations had accomplished their horrific goal in much of Europe. The ghettos were empty, their inhabitants dead or in camps. The Jewish presence that had shaped cities and towns for centuries was erased. In the East, fields and forests hid mass graves. In the West, communities that had once thrived were reduced to a handful of survivors. The trains that had carried millions to their deaths went back to carrying coal, soldiers, and goods, their role in genocide unmarked except in the memories of those few who had escaped their cargo. The deportations to death camps stand as one of the most chilling examples of how modern infrastructure and state administration can be turned to the service of mass murder. They required no new technology beyond the railway, no special skill beyond scheduling and record keeping. What was new was the purpose to which these means were put, the complete annihilation of a people. In this way, the deportations embody the essence of the Holocaust, modernity harnessed to barbarism, bureaucracy serving ideology, and efficiency applied to the destruction of human life on an unimaginable scale. Auschwitz, perhaps the most infamous name in the geography of the Holocaust, was not merely a concentration camp, nor only an extermination site, nor simply a prison for those deemed enemies by the Nazi state. It was all of these things at once, a place where the political vision of the Nazi leadership intersected with industrial methods, military discipline, pseudo-scientific racial ideology, and the calculated dehumanization of millions, creating what can only be described as a complex and terrifying machine of death, a place whose operations were as methodical as any factory, yet whose sole product was human suffering and annihilation. To understand Auschwitz as the machinery of the Holocaust, one must step back and examine both its physical evolution and its symbolic place in Nazi policy. Situated in southern Poland, near the town of Wiesel, Auschwitz was selected in 1940 initially as a camp for Polish political prisoners. Its location deemed suitable due to its proximity to major rail lines, its relative isolation from large urban centers, and its potential for expansion. What began as a converted Polish army barracks for a few thousand detainees would, over the course of 5 years, metastasized into a sprawling complex of over 40 subcamps, each serving specific purposes. Auschwitz II, the original camp and administrative hub. Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the vast extermination center. Auschwitz III Monowitz, the industrial slave labor site tied to German chemical giant IG Farben, and a web of smaller labor and detention camps stretching across the region. The machinery of Auschwitz was not a metaphor in the abstract sense, it was literal. A combination of steel rails, barbed wire, watchtowers, crematory ovens, Zyklon B pellets, cattle cars, sorting tables, and gas chambers. An assembly line approach to killing and body disposal that fused modern industrial efficiency with medieval cruelty. From the moment the SS assumed control of the site under the command of Rudolf Höss, a man who would later become the chief architect of its logistical systems, the camp's development was driven by the interplay of ideological goals and practical constraints. Nazi racial ideology, codified in policies that targeted Jews, Roma, Soviet POWs, and other so-called undesirables, provided the justification. Military priorities in wartime Germany, including the demand for labor and resources, determined much of the camp's structure. By 1941, as the Nazi war against the Soviet Union escalated into a war of racial extermination, Auschwitz began its transformation from a concentration camp into the epicenter of the final solution. It was here, in 1942, that the SS perfected the system of mass killing using Zyklon B gas, a cyanide-based pesticide initially intended for fumigation of barracks, but found after grim experimentation on Soviet prisoners to be devastatingly effective against human beings in enclosed spaces. The decision to use Zyklon B was not a spontaneous act, but a calculated shift towards methods that could kill thousands at a time while sparing SS personnel. The psychological strain of mass shootings as carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. This was the machinery at work not only in the mechanical sense, but in the bureaucratic, inhuman rationality that sought solutions to mass murder as if they were engineering problems. Auschwitz II-Birkenau, constructed beginning in October 1941, became the largest killing site within the complex and the single most efficient center of mass extermination in Nazi-occupied Europe. Its design was a grotesque parody of a production plant. Railway tracks extended deep into the camp, splitting into sidings that allowed entire trains, often carrying over 2,000 deportees at once, to arrive directly at the ramp, where selections were made. These selections, conducted by SS doctors such as Joseph Mengele, were brutally swift. With a glance or a flick of the hand, the arriving prisoners were divided into those deemed fit for labor and those to be killed immediately. The latter were herded into undressing rooms under the pretense of delusing or showering, then forced into gas chambers disguised as bathhouses, where Zyklon B pellets were dropped through vents in the ceiling or side openings. Death usually took between 10 and 20 minutes, the victims gasping for air as cyanide gas attacked their bodies. SS personnel, often aided by prisoner work units known as Sonderkommandos, would then remove the corpses, extract gold teeth, cut hair, and transport the bodies to the crematoria ovens or open-air pits for burning. The machinery was designed for speed and concealment. Multiple gas chambers and crematoria could operate simultaneously, and during peak killing periods in 1944, especially during the deportations from Hungary. The Auschwitz complex murdered and disposed of over 10,000 people in a single day. Yet Auschwitz was more than a site of killing. It was a hub in a larger network of exploitation. Those selected for labor were registered, tattooed with identification numbers, and assigned to work in slave labor projects ranging from camp maintenance to armaments production. At Auschwitz III Monowitz, prisoners toiled in appalling conditions for IG Farben, producing synthetic rubber and fuels essential to the German war effort. The SS profited enormously from this forced labor, leasing prisoners to industrial firms for fees and confiscating their meager personal possessions upon arrival. These possessions, suitcases, clothing, jewelry, even the hair shaved from victims. Heads were sorted in warehouses known by prisoners as Canada, a bitterly ironic nickname for their abundance, and then shipped back to Germany for reuse. The camp thus functioned as both a killing center and an economic engine, feeding the Nazi war machine in every conceivable way. This dual function was itself part of the machinery. The capacity to extract every possible ounce of value from human beings before extinguishing their lives was central to the camp's operation. The human cost of Auschwitz cannot be measured solely in numbers. Though the numbers themselves are staggering, historians estimate that at least 1 million people perished there. the vast majority of them Jews, but also tens of thousands of Poles, Roma, Soviet POWs, and others. The terror of the place was magnified by its internal structure, the rigid hierarchy of SS officers, kapos prisoner functionaries, often brutal themselves, and ordinary inmates, the constant surveillance, the arbitrary punishments and public executions, the starvation rations, and back-breaking labor. The medical experiments conducted by figures like Mengele, Karl Kloberg, and Horst Schumann, whose so-called research involved sterilizations, exposure to diseases, and lethal injections. In this environment, survival often depended on chance, on small acts of solidarity, or on a prisoner's ability to secure a marginally safer work assignment. The machinery here was psychological as well as physical. By breaking the will of prisoners, by eroding their sense of humanity, the Nazis made resistance nearly impossible and facilitated the smooth operation of the killing system. What distinguished Auschwitz from other killing centers like Treblinka, Sobibor, or Belzec was its scale and complexity. Those camps were primarily extermination sites, designed to kill and dispose of victims rapidly without significant detention facilities. Auschwitz, by contrast, was a hybrid institution simultaneously a concentration camp, labor camp, and death camp. This made it the perfect embodiment of the Nazi system, where ideological, economic, and military goals converged in one location: the SS administration. Under commanders such as Höss, Arthur Liebe-Henschel, and later Richard Baer, maintained meticulous records, issued detailed orders, and coordinated with the Reich Main Security Office, RSSA, the Economic and Administrative Main Office, WWII, and a private industry. And so, as I stood in the corner office with the skyline stretching endlessly before me, the very office they used to fantasize about, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come, not out of bitterness, but out of sheer resolve. The person who once shared my mornings and whispered promises under starry skies had thrown those vows into the dirt, choosing ambition cloaked in affection over loyalty and sincerity. They didn't just leave me. They shattered me and expected I would stay broken, but I didn't. I built myself back piece by jagged piece, sharper and smarter, learning every cruel lesson they thought would destroy me. When I found out about the job, their dream job, I knew I had the chance not just to rise, but to rise in a way that would make them feel everything they tried to erase. I didn't lie, cheat, or sabotage. I studied harder, worked longer, networked better, and built the kind of resume and presence that couldn't be ignored. And when the final decision came down, it was me, not them, who was chosen. Because while they spent their time manipulating others for quick gain, I had quietly outgrown their reach. The irony wasn't lost on me when they sent that congratulatory message, masking disbelief with polite praise. They didn't know I knew how much this job meant to them, how often they had spoken about it like it was destiny, how they believed no one could take it from them. But fate does favor the arrogant. It favors the relentless. I had spent nights imagining what I'd say if this moment ever came, how I'd flaunt it, how I'd seek revenge. But standing in the very position they once believed belonged to them, I felt no urge to gloat. I didn't need to. The silence of their disbelief, the tension in their forced smile, the awkward shuffle of their confidence crumbling. It was louder than any words I could speak. I had already won. They took something irreplaceable from me, my trust, my love, my time. But I turned that loss into something powerful, something real. They wanted to break me, but they only woke up the part of me I had long suppressed, the part that knows its worth, that never begs to be seen, that creates its own spotlight. Every step I took after that betrayal was a quiet war cry. When I stayed in while they partied with someone new, when I learned skills they never thought I'd need, when I walked into the interview room carrying not just my credentials but the weight of everything they made me feel, it was all part of the plan I never announced, because revenge, I learned, isn't always about making someone hurt. Sometimes it's just about taking back what's yours and watching them realize they never should have underestimated you. The job they lost was just a title. What really unraveled them was the reality that I was no longer in their shadow. They watched me succeed in the space they thought only had room for them. And that defeat, quiet, slow-burning, humiliating, was sweeter than any scripted act of payback could ever be. I no longer needed their validation, affection, or even apology. They were a closed chapter, a minor character in a story they thought they were writing, but which I had quietly taken control of. And in taking their dream job, I didn't just outshine them, I outgrew them. I walked away with more than a title, more than a salary or a view from the top floor. I walked away with peace, self-worth, and the satisfaction of knowing that I didn't have to play dirty to win. I just had to be better, and I was. So now, when people congratulate me on the new role, on the swift rise, on the respect I command, I just smile. They don't know the full story, and they don't need to. The only person who truly understands the magnitude of this victory is the one still trying to figure out how they lost everything by choosing someone else over the person who could they stood by them forever. But that's the thing about betrayal, it's a gamble.